My name is Isolde Harriman, and I will never forget the way his words sliced through me that night. My father didn't whisper, he didn't keep it between us. He made sure the entire hall heard it, his voice sharp as the salt wind off the Atlantic. Only important people are invited, he said. Then he turned his eyes on me, the same eyes that had once taught me to tie a knot, to bait a line, to read the tide. His mouth twisted. Not you. The laughter came next. Low and quick at first, then swelling like a current, dragging me back decades in an instant. Old fishermen, men who had known me since I was a girl, chuckled into their beers. Their wives shook their heads, embarrassed for me but unwilling to stand against the king of the room, Arthur Harriman, my father. That sting, it wasn't new. It was old scar tissue torn open again, the exact same wound I carried from childhood. It was the echo of birthdays where my brother Elliot got the biggest slice of cake. The trophies displayed on the mantel while my achievements disappeared into dusty boxes. It was his proud declarations at Sunday dinners. My son the lawyer, while I sat invisible across the table, my mother slipping the best cut of fish onto my plate in silence, her eyes the only reminder that someone in that house saw me. Standing in Fisherman's Hall at 75. My father hadn't changed at all. He was taller somehow in that moment, not in inches but in presence, the kind of presence that demanded the room bend around him. His cronies leaned in, feeding off his authority. And I, a colonel in the United States Air Force with ribbons pinned to my chest, suddenly felt small again. The irony was almost unbearable. I had stitched together broken bodies under fire in Afghanistan. I had pressed my palm to a young private's chest, blood soaking through my fingers, whispering, "Stay with me," until his lungs finally obeyed. I had walked battlefields where silence meant death and noise meant worse. And yet here in the stale air of my hometown, my father's voice alone was enough to rattle me more than enemy fire ever had. I wanted to say something. God, I wanted to, but years in uniform had trained me in discipline. Rage was a luxury you couldn't afford in a war zone. And apparently not in front of your father's friends either. My jaw tightened, but my voice stayed quiet, as steady as I could make it. Copy, that was all I said, military brevity. A word that meant I'd heard him, acknowledged him, accepted the order. My father smirked, satisfied, and turned back to polishing his reputation with the same ease he once polished the mast of his fishing boats. And just like that, I was erased again. His daughter, not important enough to stand among the men who had grown up alongside me, not important enough even to exist in his story. I stood rooted to the floor. Long enough to feel the laughter fade back into conversation, long enough for the sting to settle deep in my ribs. And then I turned toward the door, ready to disappear into the night the way I always had. That was his power, to make me vanish without even raising his hand. But as I reached for the exit, something inside me shifted. I thought of my mother, Eleanor, pressing that chipped porcelain teacup into my palm before she died. "Don't let your father make you small," she had whispered. I had carried those words through deployments, through deserts, through hospital tents lit by the red glow of generators. They were scripture carved into my bones. And suddenly, standing in that hall with the stink of fish and old beer clinging to the air, I realized I couldn't keep letting him write my story. Not anymore. This time, I wasn't going to vanish. The drive back to my father's house felt like moving through a photograph that never changed. New Bedford hadn't aged gracefully, but it hadn't aged at all either. The salt still clung to the streets, the same cracked pavement lined with fishing nets tossed carelessly outside garages, the same smell of diesel and brine hanging heavy in the night air. It was a town that carried its past like an anchor, refusing to drift forward. The house stood waiting at the end of a narrow lane. Clapboard siding weathered gray by decades of storms, brass ship's bell mounted by the door. I could have walked blindfolded and still known every creak of the porch boards, every hiss of the wind through the loose window frames. For years, the Air Force had been my home, hangars echoing with the hum of engines, tents pitched against Afghan sandstorms, sterile hospital corridors with antiseptic stinging my nose. But this house, this was where the real battles had always been fought. I stepped inside. Silence wrapped the rooms like gauze, not comforting but suffocating. My boots clicked against the hardwood floor, and for a moment I half expected to hear my mother's voice drifting from the kitchen or the scent of her chowder rising from the pot. Instead, there was only dust and the faint smell of wood polish. He was exactly where I knew he would be. My father sat in the living room, hunched over a wooden schooner model, rubbing its mast with a cloth as though the world depended on that shine. His hands were older now, knuckles swollen, veins raised like the ropes he once coiled on deck, but the authority in those hands remained. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't need to. The room already belonged to him. I cleared my throat. Dad, no answer, just the steady rhythm of cloth against wood. I heard about the birthday party. I tried again. My voice came out careful, even hopeful, though I hated myself for it. Do you need anything from me? Can I help? His movements didn't falter. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, deliberate, sharpened by years of knowing how to cut deepest with the fewest words. Only important people are invited, not you. The words landed like salt in an old wound, reopening a scar I had carried since childhood. My jaw clenched, muscles tightening with the instinct to fire back. But years of command had taught me control. Anger solves nothing. It only gives your enemy satisfaction. So I did what I always did. I swallowed it down. My reply was quiet, clipped. Copy. He returned to polishing as though I hadn't spoken, as though I wasn't standing there at all. That was his power, not the sharpness of his insults, but the ease with which he erased me. I lingered in the room long enough to feel the dismissal press against my ribs like weight on a fracture. Then I turned toward the door. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to win from him. But I couldn't leave empty-handed. Not this time. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photograph of my mother, Eleanor, her gentle smile frozen in black and white. She had been the quiet strength of this house, the one person who had ever made me feel seen. The chipped porcelain teacup she had pressed into my hands before she died flashed across my memory. Don't let your father make you small, she had whispered. Those words had carried me through firefights, through grief, through every attempt to erase me. I reached for the photo, tracing the edge of the frame with my fingers before setting it back in place. It was hers, not his. Mine, not his. My only gift to this house tonight would be leaving her memory untouched, preserved beyond his reach. The schooner's mast gleamed as he polished on, head bent, lost in a world where I did not exist. I stepped out into the night, the door shutting behind me with a hollow thud. The air outside was sharp with salt, the wind carrying the low hum of the sea. Somewhere in the distance, gulls cried out, their calls ragged against the dark. He thought he had drawn the line of who counted as important. What he didn't know, what no one in that hall would know until tomorrow night, was that line was about to dissolve. He had written his story about me and he had clung to it for decades. But stories only hold power as long as they go unchallenged. And I was done being small. If my father's house was a museum of storms weathered and battles endured, then Elliot was its crown jewel. My brother had always been the golden boy, polished and untouchable, his life displayed like a trophy case my father paraded in front of anyone who would listen. I still remember the dinners. My father would lean back in his chair, voice booming with pride, retelling Elliot's victories in court as if he himself had argued the cases. My son, the lawyer, Boston educated, sharp as a harpoon, making judges tremble with his words. He'd puff his chest, laugh loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Meanwhile, Elliot would sit there in his perfectly pressed shirt, smiling just enough to appear modest, basking in the glow of a man who had never been stingy with praise for him. And me, I sat across the table, a ghost in my own family. My fork scraped quietly against the plate, my presence little more than background noise. The only person who ever noticed was my mother. She'd slipped the best cut of fish onto my plate when my father wasn't looking, her eyes soft, steady, saying what she never dared speak aloud. I see you. That silent act, small as it was, kept me alive more than once. By 19, I couldn't breathe under that roof anymore. Elliot's shadow stretched too far, and my father's approval was a horizon I would never reach. So I enlisted in the Air Force, not out of rebellion. Not even to prove something, at least that's what I told myself. I enlisted because I needed air, and the military promised both distance and purpose. I chose medical service, though my father scoffed when he found out. What good is patching people up? You'll never have the respect Elliot commands. His words followed me onto the plane that carried me across the Atlantic, into deserts and dust storms I had only read about. Afghanistan hit me like a furnace when I stepped off the transport, the air dry enough to crack skin. The mountains jagged against a sky that never softened. The base smelled of jet fuel and sweat, the ground trembling with the constant roar of engines. I was assigned to a medical tent, the kind lit by generators that buzzed like angry bees and always carried the tang of antiseptic. I'll never forget the first time I knelt in the sand, blood soaking into my uniform. A young private had been torn open by shrapnel, his chest rising in shallow, panicked gasps. Dust clung to his lashes. My hands pressed against the wound, blood hot and sticky between my fingers. Around me the air was chaos, shouts, gunfire, the thud of boots, but in that circle of dirt it was only him and me. Stay with me, I said, my voice low, steady, though inside I felt the weight of the world tipping. Breathe, don't you quit. His eyes fluttered, then locked on mine. He did breathe, he did stay, and when his pulse steadied beneath my hand, I understood something my father would never grasp. Leadership isn't about commanding attention. It's about holding the line when someone else's life hangs in the balance. Moments like that forged me, not medals, not promotions, not titles. The necessity of stepping into chaos and refusing to blink, that's what made me a leader. But back home, none of it mattered. To the town, I was still Arthur Harriman's girl who went off to do something vague with the military. To my father, I was a footnote, a punchline, the daughter who left. Elliot was the one he boasted about down at the docks, the one whose name carried weight among the fishermen. I was invisible ink in the family ledger. That's the thing about shadows, they don't just block the light. They convince you that you don't deserve to stand in it. For years, I let that shadow cover me. For years, I carried the silence like a second skin. But Afghanistan had taught me something else too. When darkness closes in, you don't surrender, you find your way through it, breath by breath. Elliot may have been the son worth bragging about in my father's eyes, but I had stared death in the face and pulled men back from its grip. And as the night of my father's celebration drew closer, I knew one truth as steady as my heartbeat: sooner or later, the shadow would break. Fisherman's Hall looked exactly the way I remembered it. A long room paneled in dark wood, nets draped as decoration along the rafters, the neon beer sign throwing a weak pink halo over a sheet cake sweating under its own frosting. The floorboards had been scrubbed so hard they carried a pale scuff down the center aisle where boots had marched for decades: weddings, wakes, fundraisers. And the occasional argument that ended with two men hugging it out because the sea forgives quicker than pride. I paused just inside the doorway and let the sounds wash over me. Laughter ricocheting off the walls, glasses kissing tabletops, the soft squeal of chair legs dragged too far. The air smelled like salt, coffee gone bitter, and a hint of aftershave from men who had dressed up for the night with the same care they gave their boats. A vinyl banner stretched above the head table, "Happy 75 Arthur." The letters sagged at the center like they were tired of holding up the myth. I wore my dress blue, regulation perfect ribbons. Shoes buffed to a reflective shine that turned the warped plank floor into a black river beneath my steps. I hadn't put them on to prove anything. I put them on because they told the truth when words would be twisted. If anyone asked who I was, the fabric answered first. No one asked. Men I grew up with nodded past me to each other. Wives performed the small mercy of half smiles, the kind that says, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you here." I slid along the wall toward the donation box, an old cigar tin dressed in wrapping paper and scotch tape. I had an envelope in my hand with cash and a note, for the Fishermen's Relief Fund, from a daughter who learned to watch a horizon from you. I wasn't going to make a scene. Slide the envelope in. Leave before the first toast. That was the plan, clean, controlled, surgical. Then a familiar voice cut through the room like a cleat-catching rope. Look who finally washed ashore. My father. He stood with his back to the head table, one elbow anchored on it, the stance of a captain who never relinquished the helm. His hair had gone the color of gull wings, but the eyes were the same, hard, scanning, measuring what could be used and what could be discarded. A ring of men formed his weather system, chuckles, cuffs to the shoulder, the kind of orbit built over years of favors and fish. I kept moving. He stepped into my path. Only important people are invited. He pitched it just loud enough to rake the nearby tables, then he tipped his chin toward me. Not you. Silence always arrives in two parts. First, the sound drops away. Then the weight lands, you feel it in your ribs, you hear it in the clink of a single fork laid down too carefully. I heard both. I felt the challenge coin in my pocket with the edge of my knuckle. I didn't take it out. I didn't give him the theater of a prop. That coin had lived against my skin through nights that smelled like burned rubber and fear. It didn't belong to this floor show. My jaw set. "Copy," I said. The word left my mouth steady, not a tremor in it. He smiled, the showman's smile, the one that says, "See, she knows her place." A few of the men laughed, late and uncertain, a spill of sound that embarrassed even itself. Someone muttered something about the game tomorrow. Glasses knocked against teeth. Conversation limped back to life. I turned half a step, angling toward the tin box, toward the door, toward escape. The envelope rasped softly in my fingers. I could still leave clean. Nothing would change, but nothing would escalate either. It would be the same pattern as always. I would bleed in private, he would win in public, and the town would applaud a story they'd been hearing so long they didn't know any different. Then the band on the low platform near the bar hit a sour chord, stopped. Started whisper arguing and stopped again. Heads turned. I didn't. I kept my gaze on the exit sign glowing red above the door. It felt like a lighthouse, like permission. Isolde, a woman breathed to my right. I didn't recognize the voice, but I recognized the tone, soft, apologetic, the way people speak to you when you're being humiliated and they want to offer comfort without paying the price of proximity. I let the comment pass. The hall pressed closer. The banner sighed. My father's cologne cut through the old wood smell, sharp and manufactured like bravado. He took a step nearer, making sure the moment wouldn't escape its audience. You always did show up when there's attention to grab, he said, lazy and dangerous. Still wearing costume. He flicked his eyes across my uniform. That should have been my cue to break, to let the heat in my chest flare into something that would only feed him. Instead, Afghanistan rose up in my bloodstream like a calm tide. The canopy of a medevac, the drone of rotors. The memory of a kid's pulse stabilizing under my hand because I refused to panic. Enjoy your night, I said, almost gentle. I meant it. God help me, I meant it. He barked a laugh, pleased with his ability to keep me in the scene. See, she's learned manners at last. I slid the envelope into the tin. The paper hissed against the cardboard lip, a small sound but honest. I turned to go. A hand closed on my sleeve, not grabbing, claiming, firm, competent. I looked down at the fingers before I looked up because training teaches you to read hands first. Clean nails, a thin white scar across the knuckle, no tremor. The kind of hand that had signed orders that moved airplanes and men. Ma'am, a clear voice said behind me, pitched to travel without shouting. This way, please. The room stalled again, but this time it wasn't a drop into shame. It was the inhale before a wave breaks. I lifted my eyes. The sea of faces parted like the tide sucked back from rock, revealing a figure framed in the open doorway. 4 silver stars caught the neon light and threw it back as daylight. General Katherine Duval did not stride into rooms. Rooms arranged themselves around her. She wore service dress like armor and serenity like a second rank. The last time I'd seen her, she'd clasped my shoulder in a field hospital and told me that leadership is a quiet spine, not a loud throat. Now she stood in Fisherman's Hall in a town that had never learned the difference, and the building had the good sense to fall still. My father's smile thinned, then cracked. Well, if it isn't Washington, he announced to the men beside him, forcing a laugh that nobody volunteered to catch. Looks like my daughters brought in a ringer. General Duval didn't spare him a glance. Her attention lived in a tighter circle, me, the route to the platform. The microphone, waiting without knowing it, would be used. Her hand remained on my sleeve, light but inexorable. Colonel, she said, and in that one word the floor steadied beneath my feet. Something shifted in the hall, chairs creaked as men stood because they didn't know what else to do with their bodies. Hats came off like muscle memory. Someone in the back muttered Lord above and then coughed to cover the reverence. The pink neon washed across ribbon bars and made them look like bruises healed to colors. I felt my father trying to summon the old current, the old gravitational pull of his presence. I could sense him reaching for a line to throw, a joke to anchor the room back to his version of events. But the tide had changed. The hall wasn't looking at him anymore. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The truth was walking in beside me, palm at my elbow, a lifetime of earned authority braided into the simple act of escorting me forward. We took one step, then another. The sound of our shoes on the boards counted it out like a metronome. Somewhere near the bar, a bottle clicked against wood, cack, and then again, cack, a tribute that wasn't mine to ask for and couldn't be taken back. I reached the first riser of the platform and paused. The microphone stood at its center, black and dumb as a boy. General Duval lifted her chin fractionally, the signal we'd used in field briefings when words would only tangle. Behind me, my father found his voice. Now hold on, he said. And the plea inside the swagger was so new it made the hair on my arms lift. This is my night. No one answered him. The room had already decided whose story it wanted to hear. I stepped up onto the platform, the wood flexing under my weight, and the hall drew a single breath that felt like the start of weather. Then the general reached for the microphone. Be letter 1E1N da noi. The microphone gave a faint squeal before the sound leveled out. General Katherine Duval didn't flinch. She never did. Her hand settled lightly on the podium, her posture upright but unforced, the same posture I had seen her hold under a sky lit with tracer fire when chaos demanded calm. Tonight, she said, her voice low but carrying, we recognize Colonel Isolde Harriman. The words cut clean through Fisherman's Hall like the toll of a ship's bell. Not loud, not embellished, just undeniable. I felt every eye in the room snap toward me. The air shifted. Old fishermen who had survived storms at sea reached for their caps, removing them without realizing they were doing it. Wives leaned forward, their faces softening with something like awe. A few younger men straightened their ties as if neatness could shield them from the gravity pressing down on the room. For years, I had been the daughter no one talked about, the one my father had trained the town to dismiss with a smirk. But in that moment, framed by the weight of General Duval's presence, I was something else, something no one could reduce with a joke. My father tried anyway. His laugh cracked the silence like a stone skimming water. "Looks like she fooled some people in Washington," he said, loud enough to reach the corners of the hall. His mouth twisted in what he must have thought was a clever grin, but no one laughed with him. Not this time. The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate, like the sea deciding whether to swallow a boat. I caught the flicker in his eyes, confusion first, then the faintest ripple of fear. He was a man used to controlling the narrative, steering conversations the way he steered a trawler into harbor. But tonight the current was against him and the tide was rising. General Duval let his words die in the air. She didn't acknowledge them, didn't grant them the dignity of a response. Instead, she lifted a folder from the table beside her and began to speak again, her voice even steadier than before. "This community knows service," she said. "The sea teaches it. The land demands it. Tonight we honor a daughter of New Bedford who has carried that tradition beyond these waters. Colonel Harriman has served with distinction in the United States Air Force, saving lives on the front lines and leading with integrity when fear threatened to break others. She is not only her own story, she is part of ours." Her words didn't rise to a shout, they didn't need to. They settled into the room like a tide filling a harbor, slow, steady, impossible to ignore. And then she did something I hadn't expected. She reached into the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "By authority of the United States Air Force," she said, "we announce tonight the creation of the Eleanor Harriman Memorial Scholarship, named for Colonel Harriman's late mother, to help children of service members pursue their future." The name hit me like a wave. Eleanor. My mother. For a heartbeat, the hall blurred. I saw her face, the gentle tilt of her smile, the chipped porcelain teacup in her hand. "Don't let your father make you small," she had whispered all those years ago. And now her name was spoken into the open air, anchored to something enduring, larger than my father's scorn could ever reach. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippled, heads turned toward me, toward the photo of my mother set carefully on a table near the stage. For once, I wasn't invisible. My mother wasn't invisible. I glanced at my father. His face was a mask, cracking at the edges, his jaw tight, his smile gone brittle. He shifted in his chair, searching for someone to back his version of the story. But the men who had once laughed along with him now kept their eyes on the floor, their hands wrapped around their glasses like lifelines. That was the moment I understood something essential. It wasn't just about me. It never had been. This was about reclaiming a story stolen not just from me but from my mother. My father had worked a lifetime to shrink us down, to pretend we were less. And tonight, before the town he'd tried to convince, that story was collapsing. The applause began slowly, one clap, then another, then a swell that rolled through the hall like surf breaking against the shore. It wasn't wild or raucous. It was steady, sustained, undeniable. I stood at attention, every ribbon on my uniform catching the glow of the dim lights, my chin lifted not out of pride but out of relief. Relief that finally my truth had been spoken into a room that could no longer look away. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Elliot stiffen, his mouth pressed into a thin line. I knew that look. I knew what was coming. But for the first time I wasn't bracing to defend myself. I was ready. Elliot's chair scraped back so hard it screeched against the wooden floor, jolting the room out of its rhythm. His face was tight, color high on his cheeks, his polished shoes catching the dull glow of the neon sign as he stood. "This night belongs to Dad, not you," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to slice through the applause that hadn't quite died down. His hand slapped against the table. "You always have to steal the spotlight, always." A ripple moved through the hall. Not applause, not laughter, something closer to discomfort. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting between him and me. A few of my father's oldest friends clapped Elliot on the shoulder, murmuring support. Their loyalty was quick, automatic, like muscle memory that hadn't yet caught up to the change in tide. Others kept still, faces drawn as though they weren't sure which way to lean. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Years of combat had trained me to let chaos roar while I stayed steady at the center. My thumb pressed against the challenge coin in my pocket, edges biting into my skin, grounding me the way it always had in firefights when panic clawed at the edges of my vision. General Duval didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply turned her head toward Elliot, her gaze cool and unflinching, the same gaze I'd seen quiet a room full of generals mid-argument. No words, just her eyes. Elliot faltered. His shoulders stiffened, his voice wavered. For the first time in years, he looked less like the confident attorney my father boasted about and more like a boy caught lying at the dinner table. But the damage was already done. The room had split open. Some leaned toward my father and brother, clinging to the old story. Elliot, the success, the pride of Arthur Harriman. Others leaned quietly, carefully toward me. Toward the truth they had just heard spoken into the microphone. The private fracture of our family had become a public fault line. The silence that followed pressed heavy like a ship's anchor dropped into rough seas. Every cough, every shuffle of feet sounded amplified, as though the hall itself was straining under the weight of choosing sides. Mr. Tate, president of the Fishermen's Association, cleared his throat from the edge of the stage. His voice carried the weariness of a man who had refereed too many dockside disputes. "Arthur," he said, "it's time, the pinning ceremony." My father rose stiffly, every eye in the room following him. His smile was gone, replaced by something harder to read: tension, maybe regret, maybe just stubbornness refusing to die. He walked to the front, the floor groaning beneath his weight, and accepted a small velvet box. The eagle insignia inside caught the light silver glint flashing across the hall. For a second his hands trembled, just a flicker, just enough for me to see. Our eyes met. His gaze slipped past me, out over the crowd, into some memory I couldn't touch. Maybe he saw my mother standing in the kitchen years ago, telling him to let me choose my own path. Maybe he saw the little girl he had worked so hard to keep small. Whatever it was, he didn't hold the look long. He leaned toward one of his closest friends, voice low but not low enough. Just a show, nothing more. A few men heard. Their expressions faltered, but they said nothing. The momentum had already shifted beyond his grasp. He opened the box. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the insignia and pressed it against the velvet board. The pin slid into place with a soft snap. The sound echoed louder than it should have, as though the hall itself wanted to mark the moment. The air held still. The ceiling fan whined above, spinning tired blades, the only sound in a silence thick enough to choke on. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't the man in control. He was just another witness, forced to acknowledge what he could no longer deny. Then Elliot's voice rang out again, desperate, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Her military career is nothing but paperwork. Lawyers, real lawyers, defend justice, not soldiers with pens and medals." His words slapped against the walls, sharp and hollow. I saw my father's head bob in agreement, the faintest nod as if to seal his son's verdict. But before the silence could calcify around their version, another sound broke it. A chair scraped back. An old veteran rose slowly, leaning on the table with weathered hands. His face was a map of scars and storms, his voice gravel low but clear. "I saw her save men in Afghanistan," he said. "That's justice too." Then he tapped his mug twice against the wood. Cack, cack. The sound rang like a gavel, final, unyielding. The effect was immediate. Pastor Miller breathed an unplanned amen. A few fishermen nodded, others removed their caps again. The tide was turning, not because I defended myself, but because truth had been claimed by people with nothing to gain. I stayed still, breath even, coin warm in my palm. I didn't need to speak. The room was speaking for me. The sound of that mug striking the table, cack, cack, hung in the air like a judge's gavel. It was small, almost fragile, but it carried more weight than anything my father or Elliot had said all evening. The veteran's voice lingered too, gravelly and sure. "I saw her save men in Afghanistan. That's justice too." Something shifted. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was in the way shoulders straightened, in the way hats came off again. In the way men who had weathered storms at sea seemed to recognize another kind of storm survived. My father tried to laugh it off. "Come on, fellas," he muttered, forcing a grin. "We all know what this is, a show." His voice carried just enough to reach the first rows, but not enough to ignite the room the way it once had. The words fell flat like bait cast into water no fish would touch. Elliot wasn't ready to surrender either. His fists curled, his voice rising with a lawyer's practiced precision. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Medals, ceremonies, none of that means she's done anything that matters in the real world. She's just a soldier, a paper pusher dressed in ribbons." His words might have cut once. They might have sliced me open back when I was 19 and still unsure of my worth. But tonight they landed dull like knives striking stone, because the room wasn't listening to him anymore. A fisherman near them, his beard streaked white with salt and age, tapped his calloused fingers on the table in slow rhythm, echoing the veteran's gavel. Others joined, tentative at first, then firmer, mugs and hands finding the beat. Cack, cack, cack. The sound spread like a tide, rolling over Elliot's arguments, drowning them without needing words. Pastor Miller, usually reserved to the point of silence, closed his eyes and said firmly, "Amen." His voice wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It landed in the center of the hall like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading outward. One by one people began to stand, not all at once, no great wave of unity, but slowly, deliberately, like men and women who had decided enough was enough. Wives stood beside husbands. Sons stood beside fathers. Their eyes were on me, not Elliot, not my father. The fracture line had become a canyon, and I was no longer on its edge. I was standing at its center. I didn't move. My training had taught me the strength of stillness. My coin pressed warm into my palm, grounding me as the shift took hold. For once, I didn't have to explain myself, didn't have to argue or plead. The truth was being carried by people who had no reason to defend me except that they knew it was right. My father's face tightened, his eyes darting from one man to the next, looking for an ally and finding none. The lines of authority he had leaned on his whole life, dockside respect, old friendships, his reputation as a man who commanded rooms, were unraveling thread by thread. He tried one last time. "You're letting her pull you in," he said, desperation bleeding into his tone. But his words broke under the weight of the silence that followed. Silence had always been his ally, the space where people laughed at his jokes, where his voice filled the room unchallenged. Tonight silence betrayed him. Tonight silence belonged to me. Elliot, still standing, looked around in disbelief, his face flushing deeper with every second. "You people don't understand," he snapped. "Dad built this town's respect, and she's nothing but a shadow." That was when another voice rose, clear and strong, from the far corner. "Not a shadow," the old veteran corrected, his scarred hand trembling slightly as he lifted his mug again. "A soldier, a leader." The room answered him, not with cheers but with something heavier, nods, bowed heads, the quiet assent of people who had finally chosen a side. My father sagged into his chair, the defiance still etched on his face but hollow now, brittle. Elliot stood rigid, his chest heaving, but no words came. His arguments had dried in his throat, strangled by the weight of the room's verdict. I stood tall, my uniform catching the glow of the lights, my gaze steady. For the first time I wasn't smaller in my father's house, in his hall, under his shadow. For the first time I was undeniable. And the verdict wasn't mine to declare, it was the town's. The hall had gone so still I could hear the faint whine of the ceiling fan above, the slow tick of the clock on the wall, the collective breath of a town that had finally stopped pretending. The velvet box was passed to my father. His fingers closed around it, stiff and reluctant, a tremor betraying the strength he still tried to project. For decades he had been the one who pinned identity to others, Elliot the golden son, me the afterthought. Tonight, he was being asked to pin something he could no longer deny. He opened the box. The eagle insignia gleamed under the weak lights, its silver edges catching the room in fractured reflections. For a moment he didn't move, his jaw clenched, his eyes darted toward his friends, but none would meet his gaze. He was alone at the helm now, his crew scattered. Slowly he lifted the insignia and stepped toward me. The floor groaned under his boots. When his hand brushed the fabric of my uniform, I felt the tremor run through him again. He pinned the eagle to my chest, the snap of the clasp sounding louder than it should have, sealing the truth into place. "Well," he whispered, voice cracked and thin, "I'll be." It wasn't pride, it wasn't even surrender. It was something smaller, a man's myth collapsing in on itself. The silence cracked open, replaced by applause that rolled through Fisherman's Hall like a tide breaking against stone. It wasn't tentative this time. It was long, sustained, undeniable. Men and women rose to their feet, caps pressed to chests, palms clapping until the sound became a living thing. I didn't bow. I didn't smile. I stood steady, letting the moment belong not just to me but to the truth itself. When the applause faded, my father tugged at my sleeve, steering me toward a shadowed corner. His voice was low, carefully measured, as though control alone could repair what had unraveled. "Let's take a photo for Facebook," he muttered. "Show we're good." I met his eyes, steady as I had on battlefields. "No," I said, "let it be what it was. This town heard the truth tonight." Elliot's face darkened, rage spilling off him in waves. Without a word he stormed out, his shoes striking sharp against the wood, his shoulders stiff, refusing even a backward glance. My father stood rooted, head bowed, no joke left to offer. For the first time, he looked small to me, not because I wanted him diminished, but because I no longer needed him to be large. Later that night, the salt wind stung my skin as I walked the narrow path to the seaside cemetery. The Atlantic's breath was sharp, restless, like the memories that still lived in me. I knelt before my mother's stone, the carved letters of her name catching the moonlight. From my pocket, I drew the challenge coin, warm from my hand, and laid it beside a folded strip of uniform cloth. I did not make myself small. I whispered, the words carried into the night. The surf answered in a hush against the rocks, steady and sure, like her voice carried back to me. The next morning, the diner smelled of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon, the kind of place where nothing fancy was needed to feel like home. I sat across from General Duval in a cracked vinyl booth, the steam from our mugs rising between us. Pancakes cooled on our plates, syrup pooling at the edges. She lifted her cup, her eyes steady on mine. Revenge isn't fireworks, she said. It's keeping your story, not letting others write it. I let the words settle. For once I wasn't bracing for the next remark, the next dismissal, the next fight to prove myself. Peace seeped in, quiet and unforced. A few hours later, I loaded my bag into the backseat of my car and drove out of New Bedford. The morning sun spread across the harbor, gilding the masts and rooftops in a soft, forgiving light. Gulls dipped low over the water, their cries sharp but free. The tide lapped against the piers as though the town itself was exhaling. Behind the wheel, I let the truth form clearly in my chest. Important isn't a guest list. It isn't a seat at my father's table or a laugh from his circle of friends. Important is the quiet truth lived out loud. For the first time in my life, revenge didn't mean crushing him under the weight of his own words. It meant stepping beyond them. It meant walking into the day unburdened, no longer defined by his shadow, but by the strength I carried in my own. And this time, I wasn't going to vanish.